Let's be real. If you're watching this video, you probably at least heard of critical race theory, and you're likely aware of some of the arguments occurring on both sides of the political aisle. Unfortunately, there's a lot of misinformation out there about what this theory is. And unless you've done the research yourself, you're unlikely to have a good grasp on it. Depending on who you ask, it has the potential to lead this country down the road into a utopian paradise or a dystopian hellscape. How? Unfortunately, most of them can't quite tell you, or they'll give you some vague definition about how it's the study of how race impacts a person's ability to navigate in society. In truth, the origin of the theory is relatively unremarkable. It began as just another legal theory in a sea of competing ideas. In fact, for 20 plus years, only a few select people had even heard of it. And most of them were lawyers.
But Azrael, how could just some obscure legal theory possibly be dangerous?
That's an excellent question, pitched up version of me. Because the thing is, in spite of what some people will tell you, it's not just some obscure legal theory. And the founders themselves openly admit to that in their own writings, which is something all the internet socialists would know, if they actually read them. Here's what Delgado had to say about it, and he's one of the founders. Although CRT began as a movement in the law, it has rapidly spread beyond that discipline. Today, many in the field of education consider themselves critical race theorists who use CRT's ideas to understand issues of school discipline and hierarchy, tracking, controversies over curriculum and history, and IQ and achievement testing. Political scientists ponder voting strategies coined by critical race theorists. Ethnic studies courses often include a unit on critical race theory, and American studies departments teach material on critical white studies developed by CRT writers. Unlike some academic disciplines, critical race theory contains an activist dimension. It not only tries to understand our social situation, but to change it. It sets out not only to ascertain how society organizes itself along racial lines and hierarchies, but to transform it for the better. So, no, it's not just some obscure legal theory. It's literally everywhere. And good luck getting anyone to tell you what it is, because it's almost impossible to get a straight definition from its adherents. And unfortunately for us, our own definitely unbiased, absolutely trustworthy news organizations don't really do a better job than any of those sneaky old leftists. Perhaps deserving an award for the most vague definition, MSNBC says, critical race theory is a way to study and scrutinize the intersection of race and law that is primarily taught in law school. It's a way of understanding how laws have embedded race and racism into our country. CNN tells us, critical race theory is just that, a theory, but the term has been weaponized, with its most extreme critics alleging that merely studying the theory is racist. As Kimberly Crenshaw, a preeminent CRT scholar, put it, the theory is an approach to grappling with a history of white supremacy that rejects the belief that what's in the past is in the past. Coming in with a bit of a clearer picture, Washington Post reads, critical race theory is an academic framework centered on the idea that racism is systemic, and not just demonstrated by individual people with prejudices. The theory holds that racial inequality is woven into legal systems and negatively affects people of color in their schools, doctors' offices, the criminal justice system, and countless other parts of their life. And finally, we have US News, which reads, today, critical race theory is used by academic scholars, and not just in law schools, to describe how racism is embedded in all aspects of American life, from healthcare to housing, economics to education, clean water to the criminal justice system, and more. Those systems, they argue, have been constructed and protected over generations in ways that give white people advantages. Sometimes in ways that are not obvious or deliberately insidious, but nonetheless result in compounding disadvantages for black people and other racial and ethnic minorities. I could go on, and believe me, it wouldn't be difficult, but I think you get the picture. None of these definitions tell us anything at all about how this theory operates. Only vague statements of purpose, or facts that literally everybody agrees upon. The US News definition comes the closest, but that same definition could be applied to almost every other piece of critical rights legislation or literature in the past 70 years. Now, maybe I'm just a cynical old man, but it certainly seems like even those defending this theory know that it wouldn't be accepted by most Americans if they really knew what it entailed. But don't you worry, boys and girls, because I believe that you all deserve to know the truth. And unlike some people, I believe that you're capable of coming to your own conclusions about such a complex topic. Delgado gives a decent, though still imperfect, description of this theory in his book, Critical Race Theory, An Introduction. It's a bit long, but bear with me because there's a lot to unpack here. The critical race theory movement is a collection of activists and scholars interested in studying and transforming the relationship among race, racism, and power. The movement considers many of the same issues that conventional civil rights and ethnic studies discourses take up, but places them in a broader perspective that includes economics, history, context, group and self-interest, and even feelings in the unconscious. Unlike traditional civil rights, which embraces incrementalism and step-by-step progress, critical race theory questions the very foundations of the liberal order, including equality theory, legal reasoning, Enlightenment rationalism, and neutral principles of constitutional law. So, yeah. In other words, the West's entire approach to racial civil rights has been wrong. And, if we want to fix it, we're going to have to rebuild our entire society.
And how do critical race theorists want to fix it, Azrael?
We're getting there, my good chum. Best way to do that is to dive into the founders' lives and writings that contributed to this theory, as well as discuss the time period in which the theory emerged in order to provide clearer context for why it exists. Just like so many other fun and interesting things, CRT originated in the 1970s.
America.
Ain't got no gas in it.
Honestly, the 1970s was quite an influential decade for race-based studies, as this was also the same decade when scholars began arguing that racism required both prejudice and power. I don't want to harp on that nightmare of an ideology too much, but I will say that PSA Sitch has an excellent video on the subject. I'll leave a link to it in the description below. Derek Bell, who can be seen pictured here, was a prolific legal scholar and Harvard University's first tenured African-American professor of law. Much of CRT philosophy was developed as a response to Bell's frustration with the lack of African-American progress after the Civil Rights Movement, particularly in regards to the Supreme Court's decision in the Brown v. Board of Education case. This landmark case effectively ended separate but equal in education when the Supreme Court unanimously agreed that schools must not reject students based upon race. Bell felt that the ruling of this case was not necessarily in the best interest of African American students, famously stating in 1984, on the 30th anniversary of the Supreme Court's ruling of Brown versus the Board of Education, "It appears that my worst fears have been realized. We have made progress in everything, yet nothing has changed." Although this comment might seem hyperbolic, and it is, Bell did have his reasons. The implementation of the Supreme Court's decision was clumsy, and in some cases, outright resisted by many states. However, this wasn't Bell's complaint. Bell asserted on numerous occasions that it wasn't desegregation that was needed, that black students simply needed better schools in their own communities. He believed that white Americans were only acting in their best interest by passing civil rights legislation. In short, he believed they were doing it to appear progressive to foreign nations. Ultimately, the events surrounding Brown, as well as other civil rights legislation, led Bell and other scholars to begin developing a world lens that would come to be known as critical race theory. This is a common theme throughout critical race theory. CRT is incredibly cynical in its belief that white people only act in their own self-interests, and thus will only care about civil rights if you can convince them there is some kind of tangible benefit to themselves. Obviously, Bell wasn't the only founding scholar out there. I've already mentioned a bit about Delgado, but another prominent founder was Mari Matsuda, who is often credited with utilizing CRT through an Asian lens. But she's also contributed much to the development of the theory itself. Now I want to put an end to one argument right now, here and forever, and that's that critical race theory is not anti-capitalist, or Marxist, or socialist, or whatever you want to call it. There's an interesting interview out there where Mari Matsuda says, yes, it is. It's a misreading of critical race theory to think that it was not a critique of colonialism and capitalism, and it was not rooted in political economy. My intellectual genealogy and political genealogy is a straight line from Dubois, whom my mother knew personally. And Dubois was a Marxist who centered on analysis of the uses of white supremacy to build wealth and power and destroy black bodies in the United States. And I don't think that I'm unique in that in CRT. You know, Charles Lawrence has in his office a letter from Dr. Dubois that was sent to him on the occasion of his birth, telling him that he needed to fix the mess the world was in. If you look at the movements we come from, there was an explicit understanding that war and economic exploitation and police violence were outcomes of a racist, colonialist, capitalist system. When I was growing up, I saw images of Hiroshima, of napalm children who looked like me. I was taught that our tolerance of this was racist and also that it had its origins in the Cold War, in the ideology that was fueling American empire. These are things that I've known all my life, and it has driven the intersectionality of my work. All these things are connected. Our ability to see some human beings as not human, justifying harm to their bodies and stealing of their land and labor. This is a package deal, and critical race theory has always said we have to fight the whole package. That's what intersectionality means. So the next time you try to tell me that CRT isn't socialist, piss off. You're wrong. Another area that she, and really all of the other founders, have been very active in is the regulation of hate speech. She purports that racist language causes real harm to people, which I'm not disagreeing with, and these harms are severe enough that racist speech must be legally punished. Stating in her article, Public Response to Racist Speech, a range of legal interventions, including the use of tort law and criminal law principles, is appropriate to combat racist hate propaganda. Although the value of free speech can guide the choice of procedure, including evidentiary rules and burdens of persuasion, it should not completely remove recourse to the institution of law to combat racist speech. Racism as an acquired set of behaviors can be disacquired, and law is the means by which the state typically provides incentives for changes in behavior. Their criteria must be pretty narrow, right? I mean, they must be pretty stringent if we're talking about legal punishment here. To be young and naive. Let's have a look, shall we? 1. The message is of racial inferiority. 2. The message is directed against a historically oppressed group. 3. The message is persecutory, hateful, and degrading. Oh, so pretty much any racist speech at all then. Except for racist speech against white people. I guess that's okay. Now I'm gonna be real with you. Just like any patriotic red-blooded American, I hate this. Never mind the fact that in my heart of hearts, I think free speech is a right that everyone should have. I don't see a way that we can enforce this for multiple reasons. 1. The effects of language differ from person to person. Some people get so shaken by it that they angrily lash out or lose the ability to focus. Others shrug it off like nothing happened. Some will laugh along with edgy humor. Others might punch you in the face. The effect of a racist action is at least partly dependent upon the person it is being committed against. Whereas, for example, if you stab someone, well, you can usually predict how it's going to turn out. 2. Even if you could determine when a real offense has occurred or not, you're never going to be able to accurately gauge how much someone is hurt. You're either going to have to take their word for it, or you'll hire a psychologist or some other expert whose own biases and beliefs are going to influence their final conclusions. People already abuse the hell out of our criminal justice system for money, publicity, and revenge. If you introduce this policy, courts are going to be flooded with he said, she said, and it's going to be an even bigger circus than it already is. None of this is to even mention the amount of resources that one would have to put towards enforcing this kind of policy. And 3, in case it's not clear how anti-hate speech laws I am, I'll also say that the entire thing is a logistical nightmare. Is PewDiePie charged for every person who heard him say that forbidden word on his livestream? Or only those who were listening that happen to be the race the slur is targeted at? If someone gets angry and says something a little too spicy, should they be charged with the same crime as the person who subtly denigrates minorities every chance he gets? Do different words carry different fines? Will we imprison only those who use a hard R, while putting those who exclude it on probation? Maybe someone out there has an answer for literally every scenario that can occur, but I don't. And I don't support vague legislation that no one is going to know how to enforce on a daily basis, and that will ultimately distract law enforcement officials from pursuing crimes where people are being seriously injured or killed. You know, like murder, arson, or rape. And finally, and I can't stress this enough, America, baby. Finally, be remiss not to mention Kimberly Crenshaw. She's basically the only reason that this theory isn't just another historical footnote, relegated to ancient legal documents and the nightmares of conservatives everywhere. It was Crenshaw who organized the first formal critical race theory conference for scholars in 1989, and she's been advocating for it in society ever since. Also, I didn't know this until I began researching this topic, but she's the founder of intersectional theory, which is the study of how many different kinds of discrimination overlap, or intersect, and affect marginalized groups within our communities. This is the theory that has become pretty much synonymous with wokeness. So yeah, she's pretty much just awful. I'm not going to delve into any of Crenshaw's literature in this video, mostly because her primary contribution is intersectionality, and that's already been covered by pretty much everybody on YouTube. Besides, even if I did want to do that video, it would probably double the length of this, so it's probably best to wait for another day. I will say, however, that I think Crenshaw is a dishonest hack, and that's not an accusation that I throw around lightly. Ever since critical race theory hit the news last year, she's been making the circuits, talking to talk show hosts and more news pundits, etc. And pretty much all of it has been dodging any actual critiques of critical race theory in favor of attacking Republicans and white people. Which, to be fair, sometimes Republicans do deserve to be critiqued, but not when dodging the critiques against your own theory. Just go look up her interview with Joy-Ann Reid, for example. It's pretty disgusting. Do remember her name, however, because she's pretty much the most influential person that most Americans have never heard of. Now, I do want to say one thing. I'm not diving into these individual scholars' lives and writings to poison the well or anything like that. The reason I'm doing it is because there's a reason that critical race theory is hard to define. The truth is, there is no real concrete definition for this thing. All critical race theory is the synthesis of these scholars' writings and beliefs. In fact, it's probably not accurate to call it a theory at all. It would probably be far more accurate to call it a movement. With that said, I do think that we can succinctly sum this up in 4 key points.
Yay!
First, and perhaps most despicably to this proud American citizen, critical race theory is inherently anti-liberal, especially in regards to race relations. It claims that liberal ideas like equality of opportunity and colorblindness cannot solve racism. Instead, it favors a race-conscious approach towards equality of outcomes with an emphasis on equity-based legislation, as well as political activism and organization. Also, I want to revisit this image for a second. I've noticed a trend where some are attempting to rebrand equality of outcome as justice. Don't fall for that. Justice already has a meaning, and it's not that. Second, CRT asserts that institutional racism, which is defined as racism within societal structures, not only exists, but that such disparities are intentionally created because the dominant white culture unconsciously, and in some cases consciously, seeks to dominate all the other races and remain at the top of social hierarchies. In essence, this means that many critical race theorists believe whiteness to be so baked into our current systems of governance that the only way to end racism is by tearing everything down and starting over from scratch. Third, critical race theory emphasizes the importance of storytelling and narrative when discussing racial oppression. This is counter to the liberal idea that one's own individual experiences should be minimized when seeking the truth. Likely related to this is critical race theory's rejection of empiricism and rational thought. Like most critical studies, CRT teaches that if truth exists, it is impossible for someone to truly discover it. As such, personal experiences become just as valid, if not more so, than actual facts and data. Fourth, and the other view that I think we need to know going into this, is that critical race theory also adheres to intersectional theory, which states that your many different identities ultimately define your position in society. As such, most if not all disparities between groups are due to bigotry, and in this case, racism specifically. Now, before you say, "Well, actually, that's not CRT." Stop. Don't. I don't want to spend hours trying to come up with the most perfect, most concise, most succinct definition ever to be uttered on this whole damn planet, only to have someone come along to explain to me in excruciating detail just how wrong I am. When conservatives and liberals argue against CRT, this is how they're defining it. And honestly, this is how CRT's founders defined it. But I mean, what did they know? They only came up with the entire fucking theory. If you want to incorrectly define critical race theory, then that's fine, but please don't use it to dodge the conversation. Argue the position, not the definition. Finally, I think I want to move on to kind of an unscripted portion of this video. Now, I'm aware that the rest of my video was extremely well polished, so this might feel a bit jarring, but really, I wanted to talk about the point why I made this video. I am actually a teacher, or I used to be in education. The COVID-19 pandemic happened, and around that time I decided I didn't want to be part of the system anymore because I felt like the system was actively destroying kids. There's a big question about whether CRT is in education. I'm not going to really answer that here other than just to say, kind of. There are things that get called CRT that technically aren't, But it's not like these things usually aren't included in CRT. It's just the school may not be pushing the literal terminology down kids' throats, but the underlying principles between like anti-racism and stuff, which developed from CRT, is being pushed on kids. And yeah, anti-racism sounds like a good word, sure, but the way it's being taught is creating divides in the classroom between students. So like I do feel like this is all important to talk about. And I probably will do a video on CRT and education specifically at some point. Actually, that was my intention for this video, but when I started making it, I quickly realized that it might be better for me to lay down a foundation for what I think critical race theory is. I do understand I used a lot of inflammatory language in this video at times, but honestly, it is important to remember that there is a reason that critical race theory exists. It exists because the scholars who are pushing for it felt that progress wasn't being made quickly enough. Now, this seems like a good complaint, and sometimes it is. Usually, cultural norms and values do change fairly gradually over time in an incremental way. So this whole thing that CRT is pushing is fairly novel, because it's advocating for like change right here, right now. That's not something easy to do with people's moral like foundations. Racism and systemic oppression, especially throughout the early 20th century, I mean, it's undoubtedly had an impact on black communities today. So it is understandable why there is frustration and why they were trying to seek different answers. The problem is that the answers that they're trying to arrive at are incongruent with reality. I don't have anything else to really say about this right now, but if you like this content, subscribe to the YouTube channel. I'll comment if you got questions, comment if you have complaints. I'll literally argue with anyone. Go and read the literature yourself. It's very possible that I took something incorrectly or misinterpreted something. I don't think I did. But hell, if you want to read the literature yourself and, you know, learn about this and question my conclusions, that's the thing I encourage you to do. At the very least, though, I hope, even if you don't agree with this video, that I've pointed you in the right direction on where to learn about it, and I hope that at least we can kind of agree on the definition here. I don't really think that's up for debate, though, because the definitions that I've laid out are the definitions that the founders themselves set. So, if you want to redefine critical race theory, sure, go ahead, but that's not what people are talking about.